And welcome, Hoosier fans, to this week's edition of Banner Monday, where we begin the week the best way we know how by talking Indiana basketball and Big Ten hoops. A few quick housekeeping notes off the top. Keep supporting our friends at Homefield Apparel, homefieldapparel.com. Use the promo code Assembly20 and get a discount on your orders. Secondly, if you want to support your local food banks, go to foodpantries.org/ or feedingamerica.org. America is in the middle of a lot of lost jobs, and we can do what we can do to help people find some food and find some comfort in a tough time. And third, before we get to our show, is we saw Anthony Leo and Jordan Geronimo move in to their new place of residence, and they were wearing a mask. And we saw former Indiana baseball coach tweet out Tracy Smith about wearing a mask so that fall sports can return. I know it's a very controversial item in America, but Coach Tonsoni is a proud mask wearer. And the reason that I wear a mask is so that I can protect my family, my friends, the students in my classroom, and fellow people in my community when I go out. I also wear a mask, which is secondary to health, so that maybe sports can come back as soon as possible if we can control the spread. So Coach Tonsoni is a mask wearer. You can do that with that, whatever you choose. We're all in this together, and let's look forward to a good discussion here with our good friend Mike DeCourcy, who I'm pleased to welcome in from the Big Ten Network, the Sporting News, and Fox. And he's one of the hardest working men in college hoops, even when there is no college hoops to cover. It is Mike DeCourcy. Mike, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing very well, Brian. And believe me, I am a mask wearer as well. I'm not saying everybody needs to wear it like when they take a walk around their neighborhood, as long as they avoid their neighbors. You can walk outside and you're fine, but you go into a store, you should be wearing a mask, because I want college hoops next fall. I mean, losing March was honestly traumatic for me, and I've had 32 of them, and 30 of them ending in the Final Four. Imagine if you're one of the players who hasn't had any, like the kids at Penn State or the kids at Rutgers, or was trying to get to the Final Four, like the kids at Michigan State, whoever. I want it next year, man. We can't have another year like this past one. So wear a mask. Let's all be really in this together. I mean, instead of trying to fight one another.
Well said. And recently you were part of a 24-member committee, if I did my research right, on voting for an all Big Ten men's basketball all-decade team. And it was quite a team that you and your fellow Big Ten broadcast members put together. And so our first question before we get into this is, what criteria were you required to use, if any, by the Big Ten media, the network, or what was your individual criteria in making the selection?
Well, what we were given the job of, as it turned out, I did not know this at the time, we were asked to vote for 10 players, first and second team, ranked 1 through 10. So obviously the number one would be the player that you would consider first. And so we were asked to do that. And as it turned out, it was a 3-player team. So I didn't know it at the time, but the players who, even though you were only voting for first and second, they accumulated the votes and posted a third team. The only directive we were given was to vote for the best players, regardless of position. That was it. So then we were on our own as to what constituted best. And it was a challenge, because they gave us a list of players that could be considered nominees. Now, we were not restricted to that nominee list if someone else struck our fancy. But it was a very long list, and everyone on it was deserving of recognition. They were great players. Pretty much everybody that was in there was I mean, like a Bryant McIntosh. I wasn't going to put him on one of my teams, but what a transformational player he was at Northwestern. It changed their whole program. And I loved him from the first time I saw him play for Northwestern in a road game at Butler. It was on the day of the Big Ten championship game. I guess that would have been around 2012, something like that. And I didn't know anything about him going in. I might have still even have been living in Indianapolis at the time. I mean, in Cincinnati at the time. So I didn't know of him from his high school days, and just went in there and watched him play against Butler. And right away, you could tell he was special and had a fabulous career. So great player, but no room for him in the top 10 in the decade of the 2020s, excuse me, the 2010s. The one of the interesting things for me in doing that ballot was in looking at it and having to gauge impact of a player, some of whom played 4 years, but maybe weren't. I mean, Frank Kaminsky was my number one player. And I know he was redshirt a freshman, wasn't a great player as a freshman or sophomore, but what an impact he had. And that ultimately was this deciding factor for me with him. So a lot of it was impact. It wasn't about, for me at all, what they went on to be as professionals. That didn't factor in at all for me. I try just strictly, what did you do when you were a Big Ten player? And so that, I didn't care if you got drafted. I didn't care if you became a great, three-time NBA champion like Draymond is. I just cared what you did when you were in college. And so that's how I decided to vote.
Interesting you said you got to vote for 10, because when I looked at the first two teams, and I'll read these off here shortly for our listeners, there were really no complaints. I mean, I can't find any of the top 10, and I know that people all voted differently. But the next question before we get we get into the actual team is, the big thing I was looking at was, how do you compare different players with different amount of years in the Big Ten? And I do appreciate the fact of impacting winning and the impact on the team. I think that is a big thing about college basketball as opposed to what you did after in the NBA. And so, that's an interesting thing to look at when we look at these teams. What was the impact? Had a lot of national players of the year on the first team. That's kind of, you got to go with that. But how would you go about, and Evan Turner only played 1 year in the decade, but he played 3 years. He was National Player of the Year versus a 4-year player, or did that not come into play in your decision making?
In all honesty, I did not vote for Evan, if it had been the best team since BTN began, which we began in 2007, so the all BTN team. If it had been that, Evan would have been an automatic first teamer for me. But as all decade, I'm like, so do we start in 2010 or do we start in the 29-10 season? In my head, and maybe I was wrong, but I started in 2010. So he played half a year, less than, he played January, February. And if they'd made the Final Four, then he would have played 3 months, but I guess he only played 2 2/3 months. So I didn't vote for him. I'm glad he made the first team anyway. If he fit in the decade, he's a phenomenal player and deserves all the recognition in the world. But I didn't because of that, because he, in my mind, his decade wasn't very long. For the same reason, didn't vote for D'Angelo Russell, to be honest with you. If they had, again, Ohio State under him if it had been Greg Oden in this decade, I don't care if he only played 1 year. Right. He was the guy that got them to the championship game and nearly got him a victory because he was so dominant. D'Angelo Russell was a great player and a worthy first-team All-American, but only played 1 year, and they didn't go deep into the tournament that year. I think they lost in the second round to Arizona, as I remember. So he didn't make my team. Still made and I'm not saying he shouldn't have, but he wasn't one of the players that I selected or would have selected because of that short career. So there is that problem of vote. For me, Trey Burke was an easy choice. National Player of the Year and played in a national championship game. Everything, and was outstanding as a freshman as well. So, his career was only 2 years, but while he was there, he was an extraordinary player and made a huge impact before he departed. So that's how I did it. What did your team success mattered? Your team impact mattered, and if you only played a couple of years, I mean, Draymond Green only played 4 years, but was only a dominant player for one of them. So he still makes the team because his impact in that 1 year was pretty dramatic.
And ladies and gentlemen, this is why we have Mike DeCourcy on, because of the quality of his selections right there and his criteria. But let's go ahead and read the team so people who have not seen this know. First team was Trey Burke, Draymond Green, Frank Kaminsky, Evan Turner, and Denzel Valentine. The second team, Carson Edwards, Ethan Happ, Victor Oladipo, Jared Sullinger, and Cassius Winston. And the third team was Aaron Kraft, Yogi Ferrell, JaJuan Johnson, Jordan Murphy, D'Angelo Russell, and Caleb Swanigan. And Jared, I was telling Mike off the air that Jared's billing this as a great debate between Coach Tonsoni and Mike DeCourcy, but I really couldn't find a whole lot after I went back and did some research. I would encourage everyone to go to the Big Ten Network website. They have great videos explaining all of the selections and really showed me a lot that I didn't know prior to getting this assignment. But Mike, I don't know if you want to or not, and if you don't want to, you don't have to, but would you be willing to share who the 10 were that you voted for?
Yeah, I can do that.
Or are you not allowed to?
No. Honestly, no one ever said that I wasn't. And better to ask forgiveness than permission, I guess. Instead of giving all 10, what I'd like to do is tell you some of the guys that I voted for that didn't end up either on the team or where I would have had them. And
fair enough.
The first player that I would do that with is Jared Sullinger. I had Jared as a first team pick, and I thought he warranted that. His freshman year was an incredible year. They were the best team in the country in his freshman year. He was the reason they were the best team in the country. He had great players around him, but he was the dominant reason that they were the best team in the country when he was a freshman. And I thought that warranted inclusion. I also voted for JaJuan Johnson as a first teamer, and JaJuan wound up on the third team. So those are two guys that I thought merited, really high consideration. That did a ton, and they both made the team. And the guys who made it on the first team, I've got no quarrels with them at all. But I thought those two guys deserved a spot. And another guy that,
like I saw you speak. Was it you on the clip of JaJuan Johnson? I think was asked to speak about that. And could you share with our listeners some of the reasoning for JaJuan Johnson? I thought that was really well thought out. Why he was selected.
Well, one of the things that I said about JaJuan is that he's playing with E'Twaun Moore, who's a pro, and Robbie, who's a pro, and they're still throwing the ball to him, and he's still racking up points. My point was to take shots away from those guys. You had to be really good. I mean, you had to be really special to wind up getting as many shots as he did and doing as much offensively as he did, for them to want to throw the ball to you, even though it either had to go past Robbie or E'Twaun or maybe come from those guys. I mean, I thought he was really special as a player. He was very good defensively, although not very physical defensively. He was an excellent help defender as a shot blocker, had great quick feet, played their system well because of that. So all of those things played into him being, like I said, one of the reasons why I had him as a first team choice. I don't have any problem with the first team we wound up with, because it was a really hard choice among the many players that were nominated and the many players that were selected. But I thought that JaJuan was terrific as a collegian and playing on some terrific teams. And who knows, maybe if they'd had a little bit more success in the tournament, and maybe they would have had a little more success in the tournament if they'd have been a little luckier either with Robbie Hummel's health or the NCAA tournament draw. But I thought JaJuan had a great career and certainly belonged on this team.
Painter would go to that pick and roll with he and E'Twaun Moore, and he'd go to it 6-7 times in a row with a little bit of variety in there, and just dare people. How are you going to guard? You're going to guard E'Twaun Moore coming off the ball screen. You're going to do the pick and pop, or once you guard the pop, he's going to slip and go to the rim. That was something as a coach that you pick up watching how do you call a game. But JaJuan Johnson was one of those, and that was one of the ones that I was doubting a little bit when I saw the team. And then when I went and saw the video, which you were a part of, it really explained that he was really he wasn't maybe necessarily the third piece on that team, and that's what makes an all-decade team real interesting to look at because our fans look at it from an Indiana perspective. But continue on with some of the guys that you thought that you voted for and had in different spots.
Well, second team, I had Luca Garza, who did not make any team. And I know that he only had one dominant year, but goodness gracious, what a year he had this past season. I mean, he was just phenomenal and an overwhelming offensive player and scored at every level. I thought that, I thought there was room for him on this team. And if I was going to have a guy who, let's say him versus D'Angelo Russell, for instance, D'Angelo only played 1 year and was a first-team All-American. If you want to count out Luca's other couple of years where he was a contributing player as a freshman, especially as a sophomore, if you want to count those out, I mean, Luca's junior year, he was a National Player of the Year according to Sporting News. So he got a pretty high vote from me and didn't wind up on the team. And then, I also had, I had Lamar Stevens on my team, on my second team. And I realized that almost everything that you'd want team-wise from him didn't happen. Now, as a senior, it didn't happen because there was no March. But as a junior, I violated my own personal rule book on voting for awards with him because I thought he was so amazing as a junior. I think they wound up winning 7 games. So they were a losing team. They didn't make the tournament, anything like that. And yet I voted for him for all Big Ten first team that year because I just thought he superseded everything and lifted them off the deck from to an absolutely abysmal start to being competitive in the final month of the season. And I don't have any problem with anybody that made it over Lamar, but I did favor him being on this because of the impact he had at Penn State. And again, one of those heartbreaking stories from this past season. A lot of worse things happened as a result of COVID-19 than the NCAA tournament being canceled. But in this, in our realm, losing that tournament cost a lot of young people a lot of dreams. And I feel bad. I feel as bad for Lamar Stevens as I do for pretty much anybody that missed out on the 2020 NCAA tournament.
Do you think that might have played a role? And do you think you mentioned just 2 players who were current players? The most current player here is Carson Edwards, I believe, if I'm looking at it right. Who left?
Cassius.
Cassius Winston played this year, which is a given to have him on that. But do you think there might have been just not an intentional bias for older players in the decade than current? And did any of the way the season ended kind of fog any of the memory of kind of what went on with some of the current players?
Well, I mean, I think it diminished the opportunity for them to put a exclamation point on what they did. I mean, a Cassius with 2 Final Fours would have been a different candidate. And I think it probably, like I said, it probably impacted him more than anybody because you look at somebody like a Lamar Stevens, even though he didn't get to play in the NCAA tournament. If he had, I don't know that any of us thinks it would have been a super long visit. So I look at him as having fulfilled that mission, even though technically it didn't happen. It's like he was an astronaut that was chosen to go to the moon. And like one of the guys on Apollo 13, he was chosen to go to the moon and he made the trip out to the moon. He just didn't get to put his foot on the moon. But he still made the trip, kind of like that.
I have one more general question, and we need to talk about the Indiana Hoosiers who did make the all-decade team. As looking at this, too, sometimes you have good programs and good teams, and there's several good players on that team. Wisconsin comes to mind when I look at it, and I looked at stats, and I think Jared sent you a list of the guys that I thought were snubbed, if you would. I don't like that because it's such a good list, but who didn't make it that could have been really considered. And Wisconsin had a lot of guys that I can understand why they're not all-decade team because of stats and maybe overall impact, but they were really good. And I just wonder if sometimes good programs have more players on the all-decade team, but they could have a lot more too because it's spread out on your good programs. But Wisconsin really came to mind when I was looking at this.
Yeah, I think part of that is because Wisconsin's best players individually were all on the same team. It's one of the reasons why they were probably, if you think about it, they were probably the best Big Ten team of the decade. That 2015 Wisconsin team was probably the best team. And the unfortunate thing for that team was that they came along in a year when there were legitimately three other great teams. And in order to win the championship, they would have had to beat all three of them. I mean, Arizona, which they played in the Elite Eight, then Kentucky, which was undefeated, and they beat in the semifinals, and then they had to play Duke. So the way their draw worked out, I mean, they had the highest mountain to climb. And if they had come along in that same group in another season in this decade, I think they would have had a shot. They would have had even a better shot to win it than they did. I mean, the Duke team that beat them was great. There were teams that won the championship in this decade. UConn 2014, UConn 2011, a couple others that weren't great teams. Louisville in 2013 wasn't a great team. I mean, they were a championship team. They certainly earned it. But the kind of team that won it in 2015 with Duke, or the kind of team that won it with Villanova in 2018, I mean, those were extraordinary teams that would win most every championship, that's been played for the last 30 years or so. But unfortunately, that Wisconsin team came along in a season where they just, like I said, they would have had to beat three heavyweights in a row in order to win it. And there have been seasons when there are no heavyweights out there.
Yeah, you had guys like Nigel Hayes, Sam Decker, and even before that, the point guard, these stats were tremendous. When I looked up Jordan Taylor, 2010 through 2013, if we wanted to debate, I would say maybe for D'Angelo Russell or Aaron Craft on that third. But those kind of players are hidden a little bit when you look at the top 15 or 16 people in a decade. But, boy, were they good, impactful players to watch in the Big Ten. But let's go to Indiana. This is the Indiana show, and I've taken 20-some minutes to just talk to you about the Big Ten. Two Indiana players make the all-decade team from the Big Ten Network, and starting with second-team Victor Oladipo. Comment about his impact on Indiana basketball, and I think very deserving second team. And I know Indiana fans would argue maybe first team, but I think second team, when you look at it, is probably where he should fall. But Victor's impact on the Indiana basketball program.
In 2013, Sporting News named Victor the National Player of the Year. Now, we name our team at the conclusion of the regular season, and I will be honest about why we do that. If I would prefer to name that team at the conclusion of the of the conference tournaments. I would, going into the first week of the tournament, I would prefer that. I don't buy naming it somewhere along the line in the tournament. So you have some tournament results, but not all of it. I think you need a complete set, so to speak. Like Major League Baseball doesn't name the MVP after the first round of the playoffs, right. Something like that. It's the regular season. And so for me, for us, it's the regular season. Now, it would be a better regular season, so to speak, if we could do it the week after the conference tournaments. But to be all honest with you, if we did it, no one would notice. With the brackets and on the importance that's put onto that and the attention that it gets, it would just get completely drowned. So that's why we do it at the end of the regular season. So after Indiana got done winning the 2013 regular season, there was no question in my mind Victor Oladipo deserved the National Player of the Year. Because look at you remember that was the best league race that in my time at BTN, and that's now 11 years. Because it was so high level. Michigan clearly was phenomenal. They go to the championship game. Michigan State was great. Indiana was phenomenal as well. I mean, they slugged it out. The games they played were incredible. That Michigan Indiana game on that Sunday in late February, early March. It was just amazing. And you win that game, you win, even though Trey Burke was better statistically, Victor did everything he needed to do down the stretch. Indiana did everything they needed to do. Winning that league, I think Victor was a worthy National Player of the Year. So we did select him. I feel great about that choice. Trey wound up winning a lot of them, again, because Michigan went further in the tournament, and a lot of those are either picked after the regionals or somewhere along the way toward that, so that they can be awarded at the Final Four. I feel great about what we were able to do. And Victor making the second team here, I think it makes sense because he was a contributing player as a sophomore. He was a sort of a experimental player as a freshman. He was a dominant player as a junior. I don't have to tell Indiana fans if the Syracuse game had gone differently, then they probably would have made the Final Four, and then Victor's place on this team might have changed if he'd gotten a chance to go that deep. Because if they'd made the Final Four, they might have won the whole thing. They certainly were good enough.
And looking again back at the first team, a lot of guys were National Player of the Year, and so you can see where they would get the most votes to be on the first team. On the third team is Yogi Ferrell, the Indiana point guard, 2 Big Ten titles. Share why Yogi Ferrell's a third team All Big Ten Network Decade Player.
Yeah, I think it's forgotten how important a player he was and how impactful a player he was. To win a Big Ten championship as a freshman and as a senior, really remarkable to be able to do that. And he carried a lot of the load as a senior. And it was a very contributing player along, in the interim years as well to some success. But to be able to run the offense for a team that was a veteran team and needed a point guard to put not to put everybody into the proper place, but to get the ball to all the players who were going to be in the places they needed to be, that he was terrific. And then as a senior carried such a heavy load, and then to get that team to the Sweet 16 against a really difficult second round opponent in Kentucky. It wasn't a heavyweight fight, but that was a great middleweight fight. A 4-5 matchup where both teams were really good, really motivated to play one another, and played that game at a high level, and Indiana prevailed. Really feel good about Yogi's position on this team. I hope he feels good about it. And then, I really liked him as a young man, and it's been great to watch him have success in the NBA and to continue to succeed there, to be able to do, to hold on to a job in that league. I don't think people always understand. Just being in that league, you have to be so great as a basketball player. There are wonderful basketball players playing in a lot of places around the world. To be in the league, you have to be phenomenal. And he's done an amazing job with that. So really cool to see him on there.
Yogi really put that team on his back in that Big Ten championship season, his senior year, and the big shot at Iowa to win the conference was something I'll always remember. And again, going back to one of my previous questions, he was a 4-year player, and nothing against guys who go early to the pros. They're deserving, and they need to go when their time is going. But you give 4 years to a university, 3 years to a university, and you elevate them to championship level. That's good to see. And then the one big, if we are going to debate here, Cody Zeller, just outstanding 2 years statistically, and the number 1 ranked team and 2 Sweet 16s, and Cody Zeller is not on the all-decade team. That probably hurts us Indiana fans. But again, looking back, if you're going to put someone in, you got to take someone out. And I know you said you didn't vote for a couple people for the top 2, but that's tough. Jordan Murphy was a beast of a rebounder and offensive player for his 4 years when I look back at it. Caleb Swanigan was a dominant player that elevated Purdue. So if you're looking to replace a big, but Cody Zeller not making it, can you help us get over that a little bit, Mike?
Well, I if I were honest, if I were voting into that depth, I probably would have included him, or at least when I look at this team, I think there is room for Cody on there. I think again that Sweet 16 loss to Syracuse, and not that because they lost that game you don't vote for them, but because they didn't win it, there's something that would have been on his resume that isn't on his resume, and I think that probably impacted him. But Cody had a great career, and it was one of the, he was the reason why his ability to run the floor, to score at multiple levels. Having a big guy like that was the reason Indiana went into that year as I believe, if I remember correctly, they were our number one team. That's why they were able to win that league that year. He had a really fine career and a really fine sophomore year. I think the fact that Victor eclipsed him a little bit from the standpoint of making the big plays, making the money plays, being the guy maybe probably affected him making a team like this. But he did have a phenomenal career at Indiana, and it's one. I think, like I said, I think that I'm not going to make you feel better because I'm going to bring up maybe the lowest moment in some ways of the decade for Indiana, because the impact of that game has a lot of resonance, and it still continues to impact Indiana basketball 7 years later.
Yeah, it was followed up with some struggles, recruiting-wise, or not struggle, but just things didn't turn out the way they were planned recruiting-wise, and you had some down years, and even in the 2016 year when Indiana won the Big Ten, they didn't start out so well with a bad run at Maui, and we're replaying all this negative stuff. But that was a big thing. And when you look back, Cody's right on that bubble, I feel, of this team. There were 16 players ended up selected. Obviously, I think he's got to be 17 or 18. I know I sent you a list of guys that I thought of off the top of my head. There's some good players that weren't selected, so it's not a shame. Gary Harris is on the list. Miles Bridges, Robbie Hummel, if he doesn't get hurt, will probably definitely be an all-decade team. He yes. voted on this, which I found interesting too, is that he knows these guys that he played against. That would be interesting to talk to Robbie about his selection.
Yeah, it would. From what I gather, I believe that Robbie Hummel's ballot was Robbie Hummel. No, I'm not kidding. Robbie is just the best. He is a wonderful guy, and he's been such a great friend at the network. I love working with him. He's just phenomenal. And honestly, if he doesn't get hurt his junior year, I believe that was. I think that's again another team that is a Final Four worthy team. They were, and I believe that was 11, which, like I said, I can't remember if I have but I think that was one of the years when we didn't have the deepest. Maybe that was 2010 that he got hurt, and that was the year Duke won it. And look who was, who was here in Indy? It was Duke and West Virginia and Michigan State and Butler. Not a field that Purdue would have gone in and felt badly about whether they could have competed at that level. So really, it's a shame for him that worked out like that. Nick Stauskas, another player who, I believe he was Big Ten Player of the Year, didn't make it here. Deshaun Thomas, I believe I'm almost certain led the league in scoring in his last year as an Ohio State Buckeye. That one of the things that you see when you look at the 15 guys who made it and then the dozen or more that could have made it is what a wonderful league this is from a basketball standpoint. And one of the reasons why it's been so much fun for me to be at BTN for these past 11 years is getting a chance to really focus on what a wonderful basketball league it is and has been. The coaches are all great. The fans are all committed and into it. Lead the nation in attendance as a league every year for like the last 33, 34 years. It's been phenomenal to be a part of it, honestly. And I can't look at this list and see anybody on it that I just say, man, I hated that guy, or I couldn't stand dealing with that guy, or they were all such great gentlemen to work with, and just an honor, just a credit to the conference. Just they were really wonderful young men.
I agree wholeheartedly. And Coach Izzo was named the coach of the decade. Obviously, there are great coaches in this league, which makes it just as competitive as ever. So here's to hoping that Archie Miller is the coach of the next decade, and Trace Jackson Davis is the first of many Hoosiers to make the next all-decade team, because he has a great year this coming year. And so, Mike, when you vote again in 10 years, make sure you keep us in mind and for your votes.
Yeah, if things go the way that I'm sure Trace would want them to, and Hoosiers fans, then he'll be that Evan Turner for the next generation, right? Like, he'll only played 4 months or 3 months or whatever in 2020, but maybe it'll be a great 3 or 4 months. So, let's hope that works out.
Well, for everyone listening, it wasn't much of a debate, because I just agreed with a lot of the selections, but maybe it did open up our eyes a little bit to the selection process and to how difficult it was to really come up with this list and the actual process. I didn't know that everyone was just given 10 slots to vote for. We appreciate you coming on and talking basketball as you do on Banner Monday. You have great insight. You do great work. And the Big Ten is just a great place to be a fan. And for you to work inside the Big Ten network, I'm sure what you've just said, it's been a great place, and it's great work on the all-decade team.
Well, thanks very much, Brian. It's always a delight to spend a Monday afternoon with you, and I hope we do it again soon.
All right, we will be back in touch with you soon, and hopefully have some good news about the upcoming basketball season being held as normal. So
that sounds good.
Take care, my friend.
Take care, Brian. Thank you.
We'll see you. That'll do it for our show. Well, tune in Thursday night, Assembly Call Radio. It'll be 3 of us guys talking Indiana basketball, and check into our community, Assembly Call /community, for some information. And we'll see you next week.